After 40 years, Pastor Bob Joyce breaks silence on Elvis Presley. There's a small church in Benton, Arkansas that most people would drive past without a second glance. It sits quietly among the trees, holding maybe a few hundred souls on a good Sunday. The kind of place where everybody and strangers get welcomed with genuine smiles and firm handshakes. Nothing about it screams extraordinary. Nothing about it demands attention from the outside world. And yet, for nearly 4 decades, this unassuming house of worship has been the epicenter of one of the strangest mysteries in modern music history. Because when Pastor Bob Joyce steps up to that microphone and opens his mouth to sing, something happens that defies easy explanation. People who spent their entire lives listening to Elvis Presley, who memorized every breath between his phrases, every subtle vibrato in his voice, every crack of emotion when he poured himself into a ballad, those people hear Pastor Bob Joyce and they freeze. The hair stands up on their arms. Their minds reject what their ears are telling them, because what comes out of this pastor's mouth doesn't sound like a tribute. It doesn't sound like an impression honed over years of practice in front of a mirror. It sounds like the voice itself, returned from wherever voices go when the singer leaves this world. The videos started circulating online years ago, and they've never stopped spreading. Millions of views, endless comment sections that read like crime scene investigations. Fans dissecting every note, every physical gesture, every sideways glance. Pastor Joyce gives his congregation mid-song. They slow the footage down frame by frame. They layer audio comparisons using software designed to catch the tiniest variations in vocal signature. They point to the way his hands move when he reaches for a high note, the way his shoulders roll with that unmistakable rhythm, the way he seems to understand something about commanding a room that no small-town preacher should instinctively know. And through all of it, one question burns hotter than any other. Is this man exactly who he appears to be, or is he hiding the most extraordinary secret in entertainment history? Here's what separates this story from every other Elvis conspiracy you've ever heard. Pastor Bob Joyce has never played the game. He hasn't dropped cryptic hints to stoke the flames. He hasn't released mysterious statements designed to keep people guessing. For almost 40 years, he has simply shown up every Sunday, sung his heart out for his congregation, and deflected every question about the ghost his voice resurrects. The silence has been absolute, almost supernatural in its discipline. Reporters have tried. True believers have made pilgrimages. Skeptics have demanded explanations, and Pastor Joyce has given them nothing but gospel music and gentle refusals to engage. Until now. Because something has shifted. After 4 decades of treating these rumors like smoke he could simply wave away, Pastor Bob Joyce has finally started talking about Elvis Presley. Not in the dismissive way you might expect. Not with the irritation of a man tired of being asked the same ridiculous question. Speaking about Elvis with an intimacy that has sent shockwaves through a community of believers who thought they'd heard every possible theory, analyzed every available frame of footage, and exhausted every avenue of investigation. What he's saying doesn't fit neatly into any existing narrative. It doesn't confirm what people hope to hear, but it doesn't deny it either. Instead, his words occupy that unsettling space between confession and mystery, between revelation and deeper. To understand why this matters, we need to step back and recognize what's actually at stake here. This isn't just about whether a pastor in Arkansas might secretly be the most iconic entertainer of the 20th century, living out his final years in quiet anonymity. This is about grief that never found its proper ending, about hope that refused to accept a bathroom floor as the final chapter, about the strange and sometimes desperate places human longing can take us when we lose someone who made us feel alive. Before we examine exactly what Pastor Joyce has finally said, after all these years of silence, we need to understand the mountain of evidence and emotion that brought us to this moment. The silence is broken, but the words now emerging might unsettle us more than the silence ever did. Those who have followed this mystery for years understand that no single piece of evidence tells the whole story. Instead, what makes the Pastor Bob Joyce theory so persistent is the accumulation of peculiarities, small details that mean nothing on their own, but together form a pattern too strange to dismiss entirely. The deeper you dig, the more uncomfortable the questions become, and the harder it gets to simply walk away and call it coincidence. Start with the timeline. Pastor Bob Joyce appeared in Benton, Arkansas in the early 1980s, just a handful of years after Elvis Presley was pronounced dead in Memphis. He arrived without fanfare, without a detailed history that anyone could easily verify, and began building a ministry from the ground up. When pressed about his life before that moment, about where he came from and what he did before finding his calling, the answers have always been frustratingly incomplete. Not evasive exactly, but vague in that particular way that satisfies surface curiosity while revealing almost nothing of substance. People who've tried to trace his background before Benton run into walls. Gaps in the record that might mean everything or might mean nothing at all. Then there's the physical resemblance, which believers have analyzed with almost forensic intensity. Age progression technology has become remarkably sophisticated over the past 2 decades, and amateur investigators have spent countless hours comparing photographs of Pastor Joyce to computer-generated projections of what Elvis Presley would look like at various stages of aging. The bone structure beneath the weathered skin, the specific distance between his eyes, the proportions of his jaw and forehead. Believers argue these aren't just similarities born from wishful thinking. They claim these are structural matches that transcend the surface changes time inflicts on every human face. Skeptics counter that people desperate to see something will always find it, that confirmation bias transforms ordinary resemblance into extraordinary evidence, and that millions of men walking the earth share similar features without harboring secret identities. But the voice is where the argument truly catches fire. Professional vocal analysts, some working independently and others commissioned by documentary filmmakers chasing this story, have examined recordings of both men with equipment designed to map the microscopic signatures that make every human voice unique. They study frequency patterns, breath control rhythms, the specific resonance created by the shape of the throat and nasal passages. Some conclude that the similarities between Pastor Joyce and Elvis Presley are statistically remarkable, far beyond what random chance or deliberate imitation could explain. Others argue with equal conviction that talented mimics can reproduce almost any voice, given enough dedication and natural ability. The scientific community remains divided, and the truth likely sits somewhere uncomfortable, in between, in that gray zone where neither certainty nor dismissal feels honest. What believers find most compelling isn't the voice isolated from everything else, but rather the behavioral patterns that seem to live in Pastor Joyce's body. Watch him closely during a performance, and you'll notice things that feel borrowed from a much larger stage. The way he handles a microphone isn't learned from church choir practice. The specific timing of his pauses between phrases follows rhythms that arena performers develop over years of reading massive crowds. Occasionally, he slips into gestures that seem more suited to a Las Vegas showroom than a Sunday morning service, movements that appear automatic rather than considered, as if muscle memory is pulling in his body somewhere his conscious mind didn't intend to go. Believers argue these patterns cannot be faked because they aren't performances at all. They're physical habits built over decades of entertaining at the highest level, embedded so deeply they emerge without permission. Of course, every piece of evidence carries its own rebuttal. The timeline gaps could result from ordinary privacy concerns, having nothing to do with hidden identities. The physical similarities could be genetic coincidence in a world of 8 billion faces. The vocal matches might reflect exceptional talent combined with a lifetime of listening to one particular singer. Even the behavioral patterns could be explained by someone who grew up idolizing Elvis so completely that they unconsciously absorbed his mannerisms into their own body language. Nothing is definitive. Everything is suggestive. And for 40 years, believers and skeptics have fought to a standstill. Neither side able to land the knockout blow that would end the debate forever. That stalemate held for decades. But Pastor Joyce's recent words have introduced something entirely new into the equation, something that might finally tip the scales. What Pastor Bob Joyce said wasn't a confession. It wasn't a denial either. It was something far more unsettling, a statement that seemed to exist in the space between truth and mystery, offering just enough to ignite imaginations while withholding the clarity that might settle the question forever. After decades of deflecting every inquiry about his connection to Elvis Presley, he began speaking about the man not as a distant cultural figure studied from afar, but with an intimacy that has set believers absolutely on fire and given even committed skeptics serious pause. In recent appearances, Pastor Joyce has spoken about Elvis Presley's inner struggles with a specificity that feels personal rather than researched. He references private emotional battles, spiritual crises that develop far from the public eye, and the crushing weight of expectations that no human being could reasonably carry. The way he describes these experiences doesn't sound like someone recounting facts gathered from biographies and documentaries. It sounds like someone pulling memories directly from their own wounded past, speaking truths that still cost something to say out loud. The specific statements deserve careful examination. Pastor Joyce has talked about understanding what it means to carry a burden that threatens to crush everything genuine inside you, to feel yourself disappearing beneath a character the world created and then demanded you perform endlessly. He has described the particular prison of fame where millions claim to love you while never once seeing the actual person behind the image they worship. He has spoken about the devastating loneliness of being constantly surrounded by people who needed something from you, wanted something from you, but never truly knew you beneath the surface. These observations could theoretically come from anyone who studied Elvis Presley's life with sufficient care and empathy. Biographers have covered similar ground. Documentaries have explored the isolation that consumed his final years. But the way Pastor Joyce delivers these insights, the pain that seems to live beneath his measured words, the pauses that carry the weight of decades rather than the hesitation of someone choosing careful phrasing, it all feels like something else entirely. The Elvis community has fractured further in response to these statements. True believers argue that this is as close to an admission as anyone could reasonably expect that Pastor Joyce is speaking from lived experience rather than second-hand knowledge, sharing truths that could only come from the man himself. Why else would he suddenly break 40 years of disciplined silence? Why speak about Elvis with such emotional investment if the connection were purely superficial? Skeptics offer a more mundane but equally fascinating explanation. They suggest that after decades of constant comparison, after years of hearing people insist he must be Elvis, Pastor Joyce may have internalized the identification so completely that he genuinely feels connected to the man's story in ways that blur the boundary between empathy and memory. This psychological explanation requires no deception, only the strange ways human identity can shift and merge when constantly reflected through another person's image. But perhaps the most important question isn't whether these words prove anything definitive about Pastor Joyce's true identity. Perhaps what matters most is what his decision to finally speak reveals about where he stands at this point in his life. If this is Elvis Presley, a man who would now be approaching 90 years old, what would prompt him to start opening up after 4 decades of impenetrable silence? Is the discipline finally wearing thin as mortality approaches? Is he seeking some form of closure before the final curtain falls? Or is he simply preparing the world for a truth that will eventually emerge, whether he controls its release or not? And if he isn't Elvis, the questions become equally compelling. What moves a man who spent his entire ministry being compared to someone else, having his genuine spiritual work overshadowed by conspiracy theories about rock and roll, to suddenly engage with those theories after so many years of polite refusal? Either answer leads somewhere profound. Either answer suggests a man reaching the end of one chapter and preparing to begin another. His words have opened a door that cannot be closed again. But what waits on the other side might reveal more about those of us watching than about the man standing in the doorway. Here's where the story stops being about a pastor in Arkansas and starts being about something much closer to home. Because the reason this theory has persisted for 4 decades, the reason millions of people have watched and analyzed and debated and hoped across all those years, isn't really about matching vocal frequencies or comparing bone structures. It's about what we lost when Elvis Presley died and what we've been trying to get back ever since. Elvis didn't get a peaceful ending. He didn't get a graceful retirement where he could finally rest, reflect on everything he'd accomplished, and say goodbye to the world on his own terms. He got a bathroom floor in Memphis. He got a heart that simply couldn't keep beating under the weight of everything piled on top of it. He got tabloid photographs and autopsy reports and a media circus that seemed far more interested in the scandal of his collapse than the miracle of what he'd built before it all fell apart. For the people who loved him, and millions still do with an intensity that defies easy explanation, that ending never felt acceptable. It felt stolen, incomplete, wrong, in a way that time hasn't managed to soften. The human heart does strange things with stolen endings. It refuses to accept them. It rewrites them in quiet moments, imagining different outcomes, alternative paths where the story didn't end so abruptly. When people look at Pastor Bob Joyce and see Elvis Presley, they aren't just engaging in amateur forensic analysis. They're imagining a different final chapter altogether, one where the most burdened performer in entertainment history finally found and shakapun sinan escape route that didn't require dying young. One where he slipped away from the machinery that was grinding him into dust, found peace in an anonymous small-town church, and spent his remaining decades actually living rather than merely performing the exhausting role of Elvis Presley every waking moment. That hope isn't irrational or foolish. It's deeply, achingly human. Maybe that's what makes Pastor Joyce's recent statements so powerful, not as evidence of hidden identity, but as evidence of profound understanding. Whether he actually is Elvis or simply someone who has spent a lifetime being measured against Elvis, he clearly grasps something essential about what that man endured. When he speaks about the crushing weight of impossible expectations, about the spiritual hunger that no amount of fame could satisfy, about the loneliness that lives at the center of constant adoration, he's giving voice to truths that fans have always sensed but rarely heard spoken with such conviction. He's acknowledging wounds that the official story never fully addressed. Perhaps what we're witnessing isn't a confession building towards some dramatic reveal. Perhaps it's an invitation to finally let go, an invitation to stop needing Elvis to be physically alive somewhere in order to keep what he meant alive inside ourselves. To recognize that the man we loved was mortal and flawed and broken in ways none of us could have saved him from. And that accepting this doesn't diminish what he gave us. Because what made Elvis matter was never his invincibility. It was his humanity. The way his voice cracked when the emotion became too big to contain. The way he left everything on stage, even when he had almost nothing left to give. The way he made millions of people feel less alone in their own hunger and longing and desperate need for connection. Pastor Bob Joyce might be Elvis Presley at 90 years old, living out his final chapter in quiet service to something greater than fame. He might be a remarkably gifted man who happened to share certain qualities with someone legendary and got caught up in a mystery he never invited. The definitive truth might never be proven to everyone's satisfaction. But here's what requires no proof at all. Elvis Presley changed the way human beings understood what a voice could do, what a body could communicate, what the mysterious electricity between performer and audience could become. That legacy doesn't need resurrection. It's already immortal. Every Sunday in a small church in Benton, Arkansas, a pastor opens his mouth and something remarkable fills the room. Whether that something is a ghost finding his way home or simply an echo of a man who meant so much that certain voices will carry him forever, that question belongs to each of us to answer privately. What matters is that someone is finally speaking about Elvis Presley with the weight of lived truth in his voice. And maybe, after all these years of searching, that's the miracle we actually needed. If you've carried your own theory about Pastor Bob Joyce through the years, I want to hear it below. Tell me what you believe and why, or share the Elvis memory that still stops you cold. Subscribe now and stay close to this channel because this mystery keeps unfolding, and you won't want to miss what comes next.